It's going to be challenging, but it's going to change. You have to come in knowing what's going on out there. I think your greatest asset is your mind, knowing what to do, knowing the rules, knowing the laws, knowing the policies, knowing the crooks and how the crooks operate, that thin blue line. You've really got to get into that stuff. It's the greatest job in the world. And I think we need leaders that are going to come back and bring that respect back to us. The police officers nationwide, you have some that are really trying.
Hey, welcome back to Hawaii Real, everybody. I'm your host, Ioke Ehu, and this episode is brought to you by the Native Hawaiian Chamber of Commerce. The Native Hawaiian Chamber of Commerce's mission is to malama Native Hawaiians in business and commerce through leadership, relationships, and connections to economic resources and opportunities. The Chamber's programs and events are designed to facilitate connections and promote business growth, professional and economic development, and sustainability. The Chamber's membership is open to individuals, nonprofit organizations, and businesses of all sizes. To learn more about the Chamber and how you can visit the website www.nativehawaianchamberofcommerce.org. I also want to send a shout out to our beverage sponsor, Hawaiian Springs Water. So you got your Hawaiian Springs water right there, right? A little alkali water going there. All right. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to this podcast on YouTube. We have a great channel there. We put up a bunch of videos and a bunch of these short videos, about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. And if you're one of those awesome listeners on Amazon Podcast, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, where else are we on? Google Podcast. There's all these podcast platforms are out there. Can you do us a favor? Can you leave a review or a 5-star rating, or whatever you think, and tell us what we're doing right, tell us what we're doing wrong, and help this channel so much. Again, thank you so much for watching and listening and tuning into this episode. Okay, and today I have an honored guest here, the former, what are you laughing for?
Honored.
Former or retired Deputy Chief of Police of the Honolulu Police Department, John McCarthy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sir, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks.
And yeah, we were talking off camera about what we're going to talk about. It's like, okay, well, try to leave most of the politics and stuff out of it for this episode, and kind of get to a good history lesson, at least for me and the audience, on what policing was like way back in the day, because you were in the police department, the Honolulu Police Department, for over 45 years.
45 years.
45. I'm not even 45 years old. Jeez.
You're the second one today to tell me that.
But over the course of 45 years, so much in society as a whole has changed.
It's changed.
Yeah, and I think people forget that policing wasn't always the way it was as it is today. Like everybody talks about police reform. We need police reform. And I have to remind them that no, we're in a constant state of police reform.
Right.
Like the police officers of 2021 are not even close to the same type of police officers that we had doing the type of work and the mentality and everything of like the 1980s.
Right.
Like things have changed. So how have things changed, or what has been some of the drastic changes you've seen, or how was things when you first got in the police department?
Yeah. It's really changed. I started in 1976 as a cadet. Yeah, and like you said, you weren't born, but it was really, really different. There was a pecking order, very rigid pecking order, somewhat rigid pecking order among who was who at what rank, and you paid it was an expected respect to these people because they had been around longer. Mm-hmm. Policing was different because, people respected police as a whole back then. You rarely got assaults on police officers. You rarely got back talking on that because, we knew people's parents. Everybody knew somebody, and law enforcement was just respected so much more back then. It was a different form of policing. Just to give you an idea, when I graduated my recruit class in 1977, and the white cars that we drove after graduating, we actually, let me take you back a little bit more.
Did you have to change the horseshoes?
Yeah, a lot of people say that. when we graduated, just to give we had talked about the history, but yeah, it's very rich in history because I graduated in June of 1977, and what we did was they gave us a day off, and then you reported to work the next day. You worked from 6 in the evening to 2 in the morning, and you walked either downtown Honolulu or Waikiki, and it was night and day. Downtown isn't anything what it looked like today, but you had strip bars. There was a live sex act bar. So there were multiple bars. I mean,
a live sex act, like
there was a live
Tijuana kind
live sex act. And you walked outside. You had to keep these people in control. They were just every corner had a bar. You had the Wolf Fat restaurant. I believe it was Wolf Fat restaurant, Chinese restaurant there. Kekoliki parking lot. We had maybe a handful of homeless people, and we called them bums. We didn't call them homeless or RCPs, residentially challenged persons. They were bums. They drank the cheapest wine, Ripple, back then. I talked to one guy. He said he was one of the first atomic engineers in Honolulu. And it got to him and he left. And that's what he ended up being, a bum on the street. And I mean, these guys had like an inch of dirt caked on them. But there was more respect. It's interesting because across from the Chinese restaurant was the Glades nightclub. And it was, the big show there was Boys Will Be Men. I mean, Boys Will Be Girls, I'm sorry. It was all transvestites, mahus. On Fridays and Saturday nights, you could drive on Hotel Street back then. It was bumper to bumper traffic. I mean, we used to actually have to go out there and kind of like tap the tail of the car. Yeah, keep moving. Everybody turned out to see the mahus because they were flamboyant.
They were just driving through to watch them?
Yeah, I just drove through to watch them. So, I mean, it was literally just from Hotel Street down to River Street, Pauahi, back up Mauna Kea. It was just, in fact, these people were families. They had gone out to see a football game or, some event, and then they drive through and see the Glades.
Hey, what do you do when you don't have the internet, right?
Yeah, I mean, no internet, no nothing. That was your entertainment. Friday and Saturday, you kind of dreaded working those nights. But the complexion of the city was very different. Daytime, downtown was very businesslike. Nighttime, it just converted into this, bars, sex shows. There were the prostitutes. They used the upstairs of some of the establishments there. So, I mean, it was really a different time back then. I mean, it was still very old. It was nothing what you see today. And then so we'd walk there, but then you might walk there one night, the next night you're in Waikiki. So back then when we walked downtown, you stared at somebody when they challenged you, you never broke that gaze. You broke that gaze. That was a sign of weakness. You're out. You lost. These guys are going to step all over you. So I remember one officer prior to us hitting a road, walking past one of the eateries there, and it was a gunshot. The bullet ended up grazing his leg as he walked past. Easy. So, I mean, it was culturally too. It was funny because you had the prostitutes never went past into the Mahu's area. There was a bar called Wonder Bar. It was all blacks pretty much stayed there. So you never ventured. Everybody had their own little thing, and nobody bothered anybody. Occasionally you get the Friday night fights, but it's like that all over the place.
You still get the Friday night fights and
everywhere,
Saturday night fights, yeah.
But then, like I said, you would walk downtown, and then the military, of course, was a big problem. These young sailors, these young army soldiers, they come in, get leave, they drink till they get stupid, they become victimized. But we had the answer for them then. There was Hawaii Armed Services Police, HASP. If they would monitor our radio frequency, and when they heard the call, they'd come there, and we're trying to talk to a drunk sailor, and got it, officer. Just grab the guy, throw him in a van, off they go. So it was solved. The problems didn't take long to solve, and they didn't last long. On the other hand, once you walk town, if you had town that night, the next night you might be in Waikiki. Waikiki was entirely different back then. You had of course, the Sheraton was there. I think they just celebrated their 50th anniversary, so they beat me by 5 years. The Pink Palace was there. There weren't that outrigger. The jungle area back in the where the Pacific Beach, further down towards the zoo, wasn't developed yet. A lot of them were Quonset huts. Later, a year or so later, when I got assigned to Waikiki, in fact, that whole assignment thing was funny because back then, District 1 was from Kalihi, beat 20, all the way up to beat 93 or 94 in Hawaii Kai. So it was one big district.
So, well, like back then, how many officers did the police department have here in Hawaii or Honolulu?
You know, when I came in, that's when they started. They kind of started to rush guys through. I remember taking a test at Kaimaki Intermediate, and I walked in. I'm, 18 years old. Sit down. Guy takes the stage, the monitor, and says, "Congratulations, you guys made it to this point. There's over 2,000 applicants, and we're only taking the top 10." So I'm sitting there going,
Jesus.
I'm not going to make it.
But even the part of having 2,000 applicants, that's really, that's a lot.
And that was only for police cadet. That wasn't even for the police officer. Back then, we called the police cadet, they were police service officers 1. And then the police officers were police service officers 2. And then eventually you became a motorman. So it would be -M. And you got $10 more for being a motorman. From the police officer 1 to police officer 2 was like $15 a month.
So what was the role of a cadet?
A cadet, we couldn't carry guns. So there was a federally funded program started in the 60s to encourage, it was men originally and then men and women, to come into law enforcement. So it's almost like you were on the job training. So you can't carry a gun till 20. You couldn't go to recruit school, although some did and they'd let them graduate depending on how close you were to your 20th birthday. So we were clerks. We would go out and do PR stuff, do the supply runs. I know at one prior to me, they would have the cadets give citations downtown until one guy got punched and they said, "Oh, well, we're not training him. We got to bring him back in." And then they would book prisoners. The guy got punched again, so can't let him have contact with prisoners. So it ended up where we were clerks. And when I started, it was $600 a month.
Gee.
So it was good. I still remember my take home every 2 weeks was $171.12 after taxes and everything else. So
wow, things have changed in just less than half a century.
But trying to get back. So you work town, you go to work Waikiki. It's day and night. Like I said, in downtown Honolulu, you stare these guys down. You really got to put your foot down. You're staring, and these guys never complained. If you looked at them or if you got in a scuffle with them, they never complained. They didn't didn't run to the police commission. They didn't run to, back then it was internal affairs. Never happened. Then you go to Waikiki and you got to call everybody sir, ma'am. The tourists would always walk up to the policeman and say, "Where's the best place to eat?" I loved it. I was 123 pounds back then. And I'm going, "You're asking me what restaurant to eat at?" But in the mainland, that's what you do. You ask policemen. They know.
Yeah, for directions and stuff. Yeah.
So it was an entirely different ballgame. In fact, just to give you an idea, I kept a mustache on. When I came in, I didn't have it. I went to recruit school. I didn't have it. When I got out on the road, that's when I grew the mustache because I went to a domestic at Waikiki, on the villas on Alawai. And it was an old lady. It was a stereotypical domestic where you hear the crash of plates, the yelling of the husband and wife. So I knock at the door, right? She answers the door, looks at me and goes, "Go call me a real policeman. I got kids older than you." Slams the door in my face and goes back to fighting with the husband. And I'm going, what do I do now? I had to go and call a real policeman. But the guys were cool back then. A motor patrol officer, senior guy comes there. Oh, he's laughing. We go up. And, you walked in and said, "Hey, you guys got to knock this off." We didn't have any kind of social training or anything. You guys just got to stop. We didn't have any, rules of arrest or anything. So I mean, it stopped. It was a different animal between there, Waikiki and downtown, very much different. And then they started developing the east end of Waikiki, with the high rises come up, Pacific Beach, and all those.
More tourists coming in.
More and more tourists coming in. So originally, when I was there, it was really manageable and it wasn't gaudy. It was still a little bit of old Hawaiian, international marketplace. It was fantastic. I mean, they had the tree. They did a radio show from up in the tree house. The shops that were there, a lot of them were trinkets. I mean, they were tourist trap stuff, but something you would expect. There was one beat in particular, 17 Alpha, and you stood in front of the international marketplace. You were the information officer for the night because everybody walked up to you.
Well, I think Waikiki still had an information officer, right, standing at a podium. I know when I came in,
they had that. They were trying that Koban.
Mid 2000s.
Yeah, they were doing that Koban concept.
Yeah, somebody got assigned to like the podium or something like that.
Yes.
It's like,
they were trying to do like what they do in Japan. So have somebody there. So,
but I mean, I like that. It's more community oriented. So,
It was a lot. Everybody was a lot closer back then. It was really a different era. Even the tourists, I think, you had a lot of returning tourists, so they knew where to go and what to do. They stayed at the Royal Hawaiian. You had the different people stay different places, and you could tell.
I mean, these tourists, they had to like take a ship here.
Yeah.
There's no airplanes back then, right?
No, there were airplanes. Sorry, there were airplanes. But yeah, it was night and day between town and Waikiki, and the money, the attitudes of the people, very respectful. Friday, Saturday nights again, like you said, places like the Beef and Grog in Waikiki. The nightclubs, disco was still a big thing in the 70s, the later part of the 70s. So you had spats at the Hyatt Regency. You had the Point After further down the street. I mean, all these clubs still run till 4 o'clock in the morning. Midnight watch, you were up all night. I mean, you never had a break. You had to keep going. There was no time to rest.
Jeez. So it was more community oriented and stuff like that, as far as the respect that's being shown from the police officers to the
I think it was both ways. Yeah. Both ways. I mean, but the police were much more respected. So I think you had a much higher authority back then than you do today. Today, everybody, they question you a lot. What do you know? What's your training? They've learned what the stars mean on the chest. So, you don't have a star. And back then, we didn't have to put the stars on. It wasn't mandatory. But then they still look. If you had 1, 2, 3 stars, you were somebody to be respected. Now they question everything you do. The problem is the media. And, here's the other thing, too. Back then, the grand jury would meet once a week or once every other week. I forget what it was. But they would print all the people that they indicted in a newspaper and the charge that went along with it. So, I mean, it was still small town kind of in a sense.
Yeah.
The country districts were much different. I mean, there were only 4 districts back then compared to the 8 we have today. So country districts were much different. Guys would go there and stay there forever.
Okay, so that was most of the, like, when you first got in the 70s and stuff like that, going into the 80s. So what was the differences between that particular time when you first got in to when you had maybe your first 10, 15 years in the department, like in the 80s?
Yeah, I think, the 80s into the 90s, I spent quite a while in the Narcotics Vice Division. I got into narcotics. Originally, I went to the Morals detail for a few months, and then knowing that I was going to go to the narcotics side of things, I ended up getting assigned to the airport. This is when we kind of saw the influx of drugs. Prior to this, there was cocaine in the clubs. Everybody had their own little marijuana stash, but nobody got out of control. The cocaine was becoming an issue, but it wasn't a big problem.
That's when the whole war on drugs really started in the 80s.
In the 80s, yes. Because now we actually started to see an influx of larger and more amounts of drugs. I remember starting off, we worked the airport task force with the Drug Enforcement Administration, and we'd get cases with ounces of cocaine, pills, marijuana here and there. I mean, I think the biggest marijuana case we had at the airport was a 75-pound box of marijuana. And I remember it was a guy who was convicted of murder on the Big Island, and he was out doing this. But that influx of drugs really started to change things. Marijuana now became a very, how do I want to say it, a high-priced product. The further east it went on the United States, the higher the value. So you were looking at maybe a pound of marijuana here. You know, guys, they might scrape a pound together, smoke it, big deal. As it started going to the mainland, it was $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 dollars a pound. And guys here began to realize, hey, we can make money. I don't have the marijuana plant in my backyard for me and my friends to smoke anymore. I can go and create fields.
Entrepreneurship.
Yep, we started exactly. And you know, I've always said drugs are the best example of the economy, supply and demand.
Correct.
It's exactly that, because we saw the prices fluctuate, we saw the supply fluctuate. Interesting. So on Oahu, we had small patches of marijuana. We saw it in the cane fields, but it began to grow, and the use, of course, here grew. Not only were they shipping it away, but there was more use here. Big Island, Green Harvest. They were growing it by the, I want to say acre. It's not exactly true, but I mean, there were some large grow operations there. Again, because they were making money. Guys were making 6- and 7-figure incomes off marijuana
Back in the 80s.
Back in the 80s. And then we started to see that, like I said, that big influx of cocaine. Remember now I said we'd catch guys, and you know, because we were like the prime narcotic unit at the time. Other guys in narcotics too. They'd work their way, long-term investigations, but we get ounces, rarely ever a pound. And then you get to the late 80s, 1984, the mid 80s, I should say. We started seeing pound cases and then kilo cases of cocaine coming in. And it came in through all sorts of things. And, you know, everybody starts using it here. Supply was high. The cost was relatively cheap. Everybody was using it. We started to see overdose deaths, and we never tracked those before. Later, we can talk about how the oxy problem led to us tracking overdose deaths. But back then, there was a singer, Billy Cowie, with Country Comfort, I believe was a group. He died on the dance floor from cocaine use. And his sister was our time clerk in the Narcotics Vice Division at that time, you know.
Wow.
But everybody...
It's a small island, yeah.
Yeah. That's how we all knew somebody. I mean, everybody had a problem. And the police department just started to begin to test the officers for drug use.
Oh, prior to that, there was no?
Prior to that, there was no drug testing.
Huh?
Yeah. So this was the mid-'80s when it started. And then towards the end of the 80s into the 90s, we start seeing the influx of the ice, batu, the methamphetamine, crystal methamphetamine. That just took off, and that created a lot of problems because now guys were really getting hooked. With the cocaine, you know, so. But with the ice, you know, like some guys say, use it once and you're hooked.
Yeah.
So these, you know, it took off exponentially. Now we were seizing multi-kilos of the drug at the smuggling points or even on the street. And it just deteriorated the family units.
Yeah. So that's kind of what I wanted to ask on. Like, is the influx of drugs and the drugs during the 80s and into the 90s, is that one of the reasons, in your opinion, that a lot of the dynamic for society's outlook on how police treat each other or treat the public and vice versa kind of changed? That dynamic kind of went away from just a community-oriented police department more towards like us versus them?
You could see a breakdown in the social structure, I guess. Problems were happening at home because guys were going out to the disco, they'd come home, they were carrying guns now. We never saw too many gun cases prior to that. Now in the 80s into the 90s, we start seeing guys going to discos, everybody's carrying a gun. You never had that many shootings. But it starts breaking down the whole fiber of the society because I want the drug. I don't care about my wife, my children.
The demand is high.
Yeah. So you see that breakdown, and what do we do as law enforcement? We weren't trained to handle the social aspect of it. We enforced the law.
Yep.
I mean, it was pretty black and white what we could and couldn't do. Now you're getting children that are left at home while mom and dad are out drinking and doing drugs. So all of a sudden, hey, we got to take the children. We're calling, the Child Protective Service at 2:00 in the morning to come get these kids. So you see the fiber start breaking down, and business starts booming. You see a growth in tourism. Downtown starts changing. Again, during the daytime, you got your business, your banking, everything is pretty straight. Nighttime, it's becoming much more seedy. You're starting to have a deterioration where there were unwritten rules. You only went this far, you only went that far. Now there's the mixing, and then there's also the clash of the different ethnic groups, the different violators, if you want to say that, between prostitutes and Maois. There's no boundary anymore. It's starting to expand. It's starting to go to Ala Park. It's starting to go more.
So you have an influx of drugs, you have an influx of these, highly addictive drugs that deteriorate someone's life, in addition to the influx of population.
Yes, both. We start to see the population grow. Prior to that, I mean, everybody still kind of knew everybody. It was still a bit of old Hawaii. I think in the 80s and the 90s, you really started to see that change. You started to see foreign investment come in. You started to see more high rises.
That's like when the Japanese tourists really started to come.
Yes. It was about that time period. And you saw business. There was a lot of Japanese tourists came. They flew on Japanese planes. They rode Japanese buses. They stayed in Japanese hotels. So you had organized crime. I never mentioned this about the 70s and 80s, but earlier part of the 80s. You had local organized crime, which made a lot of their money off gambling. But you make money quick and fast off gambling, but you make more money off drugs. So now you start seeing that. And it's the same like you hear about the mafia. They never got delved into the drugs because it's too risky and all that. Well, organized crime went that way too. And even with the Japanese, we started seeing the Yakuza have a pretty good presence in the 80s and 90s here in Hawaii. The triads started coming in, the Chinese triads. There were a lot of things that started to change and erode that fiber of our community life, our family lives. So you saw less respect towards the policemen, and the policemen, and when I say policemen, I'm using that term generically. I'm not offending women or men.
The police officers.
Yes. There was just that erosion. People that were pushing it more because of the drug use. I mean, You had to deal with more drunks. You dealt with more addicts, and there were more people starting to live on the street. Not nearly what we got now.
Yeah, that had to have been a drastic change in the homeless population, because before in the 70s, you were talking about like just bums, just homeless bums, people that just didn't have a residence to live in. And now, well, not now, but after that in the 90s, you have these actual drug addicts who are now the homeless population.
Well, and then with the building, you actually see people getting pushed out because there's nowhere to stay. The old places that they could rent and could afford no longer were there. So, they're using drugs, they're drinking, they're out on the street. So you're seeing a little bit, but it's drug related and it's alcohol related. It's still not so much of a social problem like how we see it now, where you see the mentally challenged people, people who are just resistant to living in a home or rules, and all the other problems that come along with it. So the 80s and 90s was a start there. And it just progressed from there. But I guess I would call that the Middle Ages, even though it's right around the middle of my career as well. It's kind of the Middle Ages. You see the transition.
You're dating yourself when you call the middle of your career the Middle Ages.
Yeah. You started to see a change, definite change. Who was responsible? Well, a lot of people. I mean, the government let it go. And I'm not trying to be political or anything, but there's an expansion. It's good for business. It's good for the government. Your tax revenue increases. The police department kind of stayed stuck on that number for a long time, because even the detectives, in the 80s, number of detectives was pretty current right up to not what it is now.
Are you talking about the
number of detectives assigned to either the districts or to the criminal investigation division? It's still pretty much the same number.
The population has constantly been growing.
Right. Well, the population grew, the department never grew. See, early on, what happened is when you built a house or you built a structure of some sort, you needed the police to stamp and sign off.
Oh, wow.
And then they said, no, we got to build faster. We got to build cheaper. Let's cut the police and fire department out of all this stuff. Let's cut the red tape. But what that did was, when they did that, they were able to track things. Now the police, if I'm going to put up a big tower, they will send you their schematics. You take a look at it and you think of the impact that it's going to have, and you submit your report on it. Does it have an impact on the permit? Not at all. They issued a permit anyway. So it's almost useless to even make a comment on something like that.
So if somebody wanted to build a condominium or something like that, like today you're doing these environmental impact studies and stuff like that, but you're saying back in those days, like there was a crime type impact studies that had been done before you did those?
It got submitted to the police department. They would look where you were building, make sure that they had enough policemen in the area or police officers in the area.
Okay.
And they would stamp off before that. It was a way of controlling things in a sense, because if you started to build a whole subdivision, hey, wait a minute, I need more officers.
Right.
I can't do it with the existing, so I can't sign off on this unless you promise to get us more officers. And that's kind of the way things worked. Some of the beats were added since then, but I mean, we're looking at a bigger number of officers today, authorized number of officers, than what we had back then, but not a whole lot. You still got, like I said, the detectives were kind of just frozen for this whole time. So, I mean, you got more, the caseload has changed over that time period. The type of crimes has changed.
Definitely.
Because that fiber of society has eroded. And there's also more calls. You see, and again, it's not a comment on whether you're right or left, but that left liberalism started to pool on, okay, what do the police do? We need more help. Today, like they're saying, we need more psychologists. We need more social workers. The problem is that you can't respond to these homeless people who are mentally challenged, because they're going to hit you. They're going to assault you. They're going to do all kinds of things. You still have to have the police officers do this kind of work. Well, we're moving towards that at this time period, but we're not quite there yet. You still got a lot of backing for the police officers, but it's starting to deteriorate. It's just a time of change, I think, more than anything. And you can see it. The outside, the country districts are starting to get larger. They're starting to break up. At that time, I believe Kalihi actually separated from what's known as Central Honolulu, District 1. So you started to get, I think you went to 5 districts. Eventually we'll go to 6, 7, and 8, but it's all starting to happen around this time. Not only that, but you're starting to see the evolution of community policing, getting policemen to talk to people. And, we had that prior. You had a community relations team, division, and you had the Police Activities League. The officers were out there. In the 70s and 80s, I mean, you had thousands of kids that were involved. Now, again, you're getting into the 80s and 90s, you got less kids involved because that family structure is starting to break down.
Yeah, and I remember hearing about people talking about, hey, we need to get back to the neighborhood police officer. Well, we need the neighborhoods first. Like, you can't just have a neighborhood police officer. I mean, a lot of these neighborhoods are you have people buying homes and moving out, or not owning the homes, or not being invested in the neighborhood. Have a neighborhood watch and nobody shows up. I mean, how do you have a neighborhood police officer if, the neighborhood themselves aren't willing to respect the police officer? And then you get the police officer to stay in that neighborhood and be invested in the neighborhood too.
Right. It's difficult because, just like you said, we don't have that neighborhood. We got transients. At this time, you still don't have the vacation rentals. There's a few, because I think the moratorium stopped in '86 bed and breakfast. So you had a few, but the residents were there with the visitors so they kept them under control. You never had problems. It's not until after the 2000s you really start seeing that transition where criminals start attacking, people start buying houses. I remember having a guy come into the Kailua station grumbling about the way his neighbors treated him because he converted his home from a single-family rental, long-term rental, to a vacation rental, and it was driving the tourists nuts. And then we saw criminals actually start targeting these places. I had one guy tell me he knew how to go to the back door and the back gate and actually lift the latch so that he could get in, and then he'd watch the first day that the people were there, he'd hit them because they had the most to steal.
Okay, so that was the 80s, 70s. We started in the 70s, and then we did the 80s, and a little bit in the 90s. And so how have you seen the big transition between policing from your early on in your career through how it was over the past decade here, 2010 and beyond?
I'm going to go back into the 90s, into the 2000s. You started to see a change where you see groups of individuals. For example, when I was a detective in Waikiki at that time, I always said I had a Y problem, Waianae and Waimanalo, because my suspects were coming from there. You started to see serial type crimes, purse snatchings, robberies. They become a little bit more prevalent. And now they're targeting certain groups. They're targeting tourists. They're targeting the elderly. As we move up into the 2010s and so, now you start seeing scams becoming more and more prevalent as well. We talked about the internet before. No internet, so you drove past the Glades downtown on Hotel Street. Now with the advent of the internet, you got more and more crime taking place at home, on the internet. Victims, especially elderly women, are becoming victimized. So you see that again. Just over the weekend, I got a call. An elderly woman fell to a romance scam. She lost $150,000, and they're asking me, "What do I do?" I mean, what can you do?
Money's gone. You sent it away.
Yeah, you sent that money away. There's ways. I mean, we did it with Secret Service when I was a lieutenant in CID, where we looked at things. But now you got all of this. You also have the advent of plastic credit cards. In the 70s, you had revolving credit, store credit. So those cards were very limited, and identity theft never existed back then. 80s, it starts a little. You see the change. 90s into the 2000s, yeah.
That's hugely prevalent now.
Yeah. And you got groups that are taking, again, no racist intent, but these groups tended to organize around ethnic, racial, their common ground. So you had black groups coming out of New York, Las Vegas, those places. You got Chinese coming in from mainland China. They get American student visas and go to work doing crimes like that. You had people coming up from the South America, Central America. So you had different groups. You had the Vietnamese, the Chinese, a whole bunch of groups. Even as recently as just a few years ago, Japan, which is a very conservative country in a sense, didn't know how this happened. The Nigerians started, victimizing their banks, and it's like, you got to explain to me, how does this happen? I don't know how. I can't, picture this. But all that plastic. So there's a much more. Drugs are still prevalent. Methamphetamine is still a major problem, but then now you can see there's other ways to make cash, fast ways to make cash, credit cards, scams, and local guys, they take part in this kind of stuff. So you see that change again. And again, you're starting to get a separation in the classes as far as who's doing what. And more white-collar crime taking place. The lady in, where you never saw it happen in the 70s, 80s, maybe even 90s. Now the office manager is stealing $100,000, $200,000 from her boss. You just see more. It's become more and more common that you see these people indicted for this kind of thing. Why? There's money there, and then what do? A lot of it is pleasure. They're not. Some, run that gambling habit. We've had guys that have stolen millions to go to Vegas, and but there's other guys, take the girlfriend out, leave the wife at home, spend New Year's Eve at Times Square. Just lay out the bucks because it's not mine. So there's no value in the money anymore. So again, we talked about that fiber, that family, the family unit, it just kind of breaking down in that sense, because the value of things, and hey, you're on your own, get out of here. As long as I got my 6-pack or I got my ice that I can smoke, everything's good.
So how has the societal's outlook on police officers changed? Like how have you seen that people their their perception of police officers changed?
I think the advent of media, social media. First, the media. At first, you had, say you got CNN doing 24-hour news. Then they're joined by Fox. So people are watching and getting more and more information. They go, hey, that's not right. And they can't tell the whole story. They got 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes to tell a story, so you don't get all the facts in there. So people are left to draw their own conclusions. That's racist. That's sexist. That's, you're a pedophile or whatever. And not all the facts are there. So there's all this prejudgment. And then policemen are put on trial with shootings, with their behavior. There's pressure to release the information. I've never been one. I like to be as transparent as possible, but what good does it do to release a police officer's name if he's gotten suspended for something? You actually, now you've got him becoming a target. Oh, I saw your name in a paper. I saw your name in a legislative report. You're a wife beater or something like that. And this guy already paid dearly administratively with a suspension, in some cases in a termination, and then having been brought back on a grievance procedure. So, this all, I think social media, because people just, I attended a conference a few years ago where well-known journalist, old-time journalist was there. And he said back in the 60s, 70s, when he first became a journalist, you had to verify everything. He goes, now, today, anybody with a computer is a journalist. They go on and they say anything they want, and people read it and believe it is God's truth.
Yeah, millions of people believe in it and seeing it and stuff. Yeah, exactly.
And that's kind of destroyed that respect, or that the influence. And they call them influencers, right? I mean, we had some publicity with some during the pandemic, where they were influencing, their influencers, they were traveling internationally to come here and just violating all the rules. And it's like, what, you're taking away more and more of the police officers' power and respect in that sense. The court rulings have just eroded what the police can and cannot do. And it hurts the public. It's not the police that get hurt, it's the public, because the police officer can no longer do this. And all because the court ruled that, we violated the poor victim's rights. Well, suspect's rights. What about the victim? Society is the victim here. The courts have just expanded their decision making. And granted, some police officers now, we've had a lot of cases of notoriety where they've been caught lying or caught doing different things. A lot of them have been, terminated, fired. But that's not a reflection on all the police officers. But these court rulings affect all of the police officers, what you can and cannot do. And society is the loser for that, because what you're doing is you're just watering down and the criminals know it. I'm sure you've had criminals tell you, hey, what are you going to do? I mean, I've had people tell me, go ahead, call the cops. They don't do nothing. So there's that, again, and I think a lot of it is the pressure on the police officers to do more with less. The caseloads now that the patrol officers and the detectives have is just unmanageable. You can't, there's no way humanly possible that you can get to all these things and take care of things. Why? Because we never kept up. There used to be a rule of thumb, and I want to say it's about 3,000, 4,000, or 5,000, something like that. I can't remember what it is, of the population for every policeman you have, or police officer. And I think we lost that. We really watered it down. So we don't have enough, because, even if it's 1,000 to 1, you gotta,
or 10,000 to 1, we're still below. Yeah.
You got all these people calling to make complaints, and you got one policeman to answer that. So we never kept up with that. We let the politics got away from us. The funding got away from us. It went to other sources. And it's not that police are the primary, but you think of government's role. It's to protect, one of the major roles of any government is to protect the property and the lives of the people within that area. I mean, we got a infrastructure and all that's definitely needed. But, if you're not safe, your house is not safe when you're gone.
Yeah.
Well, what good does it do?
So I wanted to ask this question before we close out here. Why, or what is your big why on why you wanted to become a police officer and why you stayed?
Okay, good question. I was 18 at the time when I took the test. I was heavily involved in a police activities leave. My father worked for the police department at the time, and I'll take the test. And like I told you, I was there, 2,000 guys. He says, we're only taking 10. I was too embarrassed to walk out of the cafeteria, so I stayed and took the test. I scored number 3 out of all the candidates, and they rushed us through really fast. So I found it interesting. I liked the camaraderie right through most of my career. But as the higher you went up, the worse it got in a sense, because you became more and more of a target, more and more of somebody that, you pour your heart and soul into it, and you're criticized to death for doing everything wrong. And yet what you did was right. The reason I stayed, especially I was an investigator most of the time. We tried new things. We went after elderly financial criminals, people who were preying off the elderly. We got to go after them. And I remember one case that we went and did. We brought the victim who had Alzheimer's into the courtroom to testify. And she was a darling. The court loved her. The defense couldn't break her. The media loved her. They even interviewed her later. Prior to that, if they had a mental illness, the prosecutors never touched those cases because they said, oh, she could have said that they had permission. Well, if she's mentally incapacitated, she can't say yes or no. So greatest victim you got. Started getting into cybercrime because nobody was doing it. Along with the elderly, one thing that really pushed me that way was I saw a man come in trying to represent a woman who was being victimized by her granddaughter. And he had everything. He explained it to the desk sergeant, and the desk sergeant told him, you don't have a case. You got nothing, And I walked outside and told me, let me see what you got, and you got a case. But just moving that way into bringing back white-collar crime, bringing back the frauds, the internet stuff was just fascinating. We actually were able to sting the Nigerians for millions of dollars working with the Secret Service. And, today it's more important than anything to work with all these agencies, Secret Service, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Naval Criminal Investigation, all these guys. It's just so important to work together with them because you pool your resources that way. And you get a better result. You're servicing the public. I think one of the big things I always wanted to say was the satisfaction of helping somebody and moving in that new direction was really important to me.
So what kind of advice would you give to someone that is possibly seeking to join a police department, any police department nationwide today in this day and age?
It's going to be challenging, but it's going to change. You have to come in knowing what's going on out there. I think your greatest asset is your mind, knowing what to do, knowing the rules, knowing the laws, knowing the policies, knowing the crooks and how the crooks operate, that thin blue line. You've really got to get into that stuff. And it's the greatest job in the world. And I think we need leaders that are going to come back and bring that respect back to us. The police officers nationwide. You have some that are really trying. You have others that are complete failures. So I mean, it's a difficult thing, and it's not only happening in police work. You see it in other industries, but I think the leadership really has to step it up.
All right. Any last words for our audience here for a closeout here?
No, thank you very much for having me today.
No, it's been great.
Great
it's
experience.
Like a great history lesson going through, from the 70s, 80s, 90s into today. It's, just from my eyes, things in society have changed so much. Just 11, 12 years ago, we didn't have iPhones.
Right.
Right. There was no smartphones, and now everybody and their children has smartphones.
They're not phones; they're computers.
They're little computers in your pockets, you know. So just in that one aspect, you can see how much society has changed and how much dependent we've become on technology. Well, that translates into all these other industries too, you know, police officer, law enforcement included.
And the crooks, it gives them another tool.
Yeah, there's always that caveat too. It's like it's a double-edged sword with technology. It's more easily accessible, but it's also you're more easily, you know, scammed. And you know, we I think see that now with cryptocurrency and the crimes that are going on with cryptocurrency. It's like, oh boy, it's a whole nother realm.
You know, going back to your question, the police officers need to be smarter. So I mean, it's taking more. When I first started, it was the brawn that counted. The big guys, you know, bust them up, beat them up, no problem. Now you've got to be smarter. You've got to think fast. You've got to think on your feet. You've got to the internet and all these things that are, you know, what is an IP address? What's computer fraud as opposed to computer damage or computer unauthorized access? All these things, and you have to be social workers with the current. Homeless problem. I mean, there's pressure on the police officers, but you know, I still think it's a very honorable job. I don't think people should be necessarily pushed away from it because of what's happening. The leadership has to really stand up, and they got to stand up for their officers and gain that respect back. We need to gain the respect of the public back, and the way to do it is by doing your job and doing it right.
All right. Really good and awesome having you on, sir. Thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to come down.
Thank you.
Enjoying retirement?
We'll see. Only 2 weeks, so.
Okay. All right. Everybody, Hawaii Real, John McCarthy.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And as always, stay happy, Hawaii. Can't throw the shockers.